The soil breaks with a dull thud, each strike of the spade sinking into earth that has held its silence for centuries. The air is sharp with frost, and breath rises like smoke against the dawn. There is no sound but the iron edge cutting through roots and stone, the muffled heartbeats of a man kneeling on ground that remembers more than he can bear. Beneath the frozen crust something waits. Not bone, not coin, not relic of a common life. Metal. Cold, silent metal. The shovel stops against it, sending a tremor up through the handle. The man steadies his breath, lays aside his tool, and pulls away the soil with bare hands. Clods of earth crumble beneath his fingertips. And there, emerging like the edge of a forgotten prayer, gleams a shard of iron, dark and dulled, yet speaking with a voice that pierces silence. The sword is revealed slowly, like a memory unearthed against its will, as if the land itself clings to what it has hidden. It lies in the earth as though sleeping, its blade fractured with rust, its hilt wrapped in leather that has rotted into tatters. Yet even in ruin, it carries a dignity that cannot be disguised. This is no farmer's tool, no common iron beaten into shape for barter. This is a knight's companion, a pilgrim's burden, a soldier's last defense in the deserts and plains of Crusade. The soil around it seems charged, as if the prayers whispered over its steel centuries ago still echo in the air. The narrator's voice drifts like wind across the field, reflective, solemn, weighted with reverence. This was the sword of a Crusader, one who had sworn oaths beneath vaulted arches, who had carried this blade not only into battle but into silence, into guilt, into exile. The blade remembers the hand that once clenched it through blood and through prayer, remembers the songs of psalms rising in candlelit chapels, remembers the hollow ache of footsteps echoing through desert sands where no mercy lived. The dawn light falls upon the blade, dim yet unyielding, and it glimmers like water in the eye of the earth. The man's hands tremble as he lifts it, rust flaking away, soil clinging as though unwilling to let go. In that tremor, centuries collapse. The clang of the shovel becomes the clash of steel. The cold of the morning becomes the fevered heat of battle. The quiet field becomes a plain where banners whip against the sky and the cries of the wounded echo into eternity. The voiceover pulls us into that memory, not as fact, not as chronicle, but as lived agony. We hear the cries of men whose faith outweighed their fear, see the faces streaked with sweat and dust, feel the weight of armor pulling against weary flesh. The Crusader who held this sword once stood in that chaos, lips moving with prayers whispered in Latin, half plea, half confession, as arrows fell like iron rain. And when silence came, and when the fields lay scattered with the unburied, this sword remained. An extension of the oath that bound him, of the blood that both sanctified and condemned. The soil has remembered what men forgot. The soil has carried the weight of guilt long after the knight's name was erased. This sword is both relic and confession, a vessel of broken vows, a grave of its own. And yet, it is not the blood nor the battles that cling most fiercely to it. It is the loneliness. For in its cold iron lies the weight of exile, of a knight returned home not as victor, but as stranger. Imagine him, cloaked in dust, stepping once more through the gates of a village that no longer knew his name. The feasts had ended, the songs had turned to silence, and he alone carried the weight of unseen wounds. Perhaps it was then, in shame or in sorrow, that he pressed this sword into the earth, as though to bury not steel but memory, as though to silence the voices that clung to him. The narrator lingers on the detail, the soil, damp and rich with centuries of roots and bones, closing over the blade like a shroud. The earth itself became its scabbard, and in that dark embrace the sword lay dormant, breathing rust instead of prayer, holding its silence while centuries passed above. Villages fell, towers rotted, seasons turned, and still it slept. Until now. The camera of the mind lingers on the hilt, cracked but enduring. The guard, bent yet recognizable, etched faintly with symbols long eroded. The rust carries the texture of old wounds, of armor torn, of lips pressed to steel in desperation. The very air hums with memory, as if the sword, after centuries in silence, demands its story to be spoken again. The narrator's voice deepens, softer now, almost a whisper. This steel has tasted faith and doubt, has been lifted in holy fury and buried in silent shame. It is not simply metal. It is memory, oath, exile, and sorrow. The man holding it feels the weight not only in his arms, but in his chest, as though every broken promise, every prayer unanswered, has been forged into its length. The soil clings stubbornly, roots coiling around the blade like chains. And as he lifts it higher into the dawn, a glint of light catches on the rust, sharp and fleeting. It is as if the blade itself sighs, releasing its silence at last. That glint becomes a bell tolling across time, summoning us onward into the deeper corridors of memory. The image fades to the sound of wind across stone, of faint bells in the distance, of a voice rising in chant. The sword has spoken its first word, and in doing so, it draws us forward, beyond the soil, beyond the frost, into the chambers of the knight's soul, into the cloisters of the faith that bound him, into the long corridors of history that will not sleep until his story is told. And so the chapter closes with a final image. The blade, raised against a pale sky, soil falling from it like ash, roots dangling like the remnants of forgotten bonds. The dawn is breaking, but it is no ordinary dawn. It is the dawn of remembrance. The sword has awakened, and with it the ghosts of a world long buried. The narrator leaves us with a breath, soft as candle smoke. The earth remembers what men forget, and sometimes when the silence grows too heavy, it yields its secrets back to us, not as gifts, but as burdens. The blade is only the beginning. The sound fades, the screen darkens, and into that darkness we sense the next step waiting. The cloistered halls, the whispered vows, the hollow silence of faith tested by fire. The sword is not merely found, it has summoned us deeper. The fire has long since died, but the air still tastes of cinders. The ruins stand blackened against the horizon, their jagged outlines like broken teeth gnashing at the sky. This was once a keep, a fortress crowned with banners, its halls alive with laughter, argument, and the rattle of arms. Now it is a carcass of stone, its towers hollow, its vaults collapsed, its windows gaping as blind eyes into the silence. The only sound is the restless sigh of the wind pushing through charred doorways, whispering like the ghosts of those who once feasted here. Amid the rubble, a hand moves carefully, brushing soot from stone, disturbing centuries of ash. The fingers pause upon something half-hidden, metal, blackened but enduring, protruding from beneath the ruin. Not merely a shard of armor or link of chainmail, but a sword. The hilt still bears the ghost of leather, scorched and cracked. Its pommel darkened by flame. To touch it is to feel the heat of old fire still clinging, a heat that has never truly died. This is the sword of a man who fought within these walls, who swore oaths before the altar and broke bread beneath vaulted ceilings, who once believed this keep was eternal. He died with his blade in hand, yet the fortress that embraced his faith became his pyre. The stones reek of resin and smoke, the stench of charred grain stores, of wax melted into rivulets down cracked altar steps. Even now, centuries later, the ruins exhale the scent of pine tar and singed cloth. The narrator's voice carries slowly, each word deliberate, like the toll of a bell after calamity. This sword bears witness to ruin, to betrayal perhaps, or to vengeance too great to contain. The Crusaders' world was not only of banners and chivalric vows, it was also of sieges that starved women and children, of fires that leapt from roof beam to roof beam, of enemies who prayed to the same God but bled upon the same earth. Here, in these ruins, the line between holy and unholy vanished in flame. Imagine the night the fire came. The roar of flaming pitch hurled over the walls, the screams echoing down corridors as smoke choked the air. Knights in mail, faces streaked with soot, coughed their last oaths while the enemy scaled ladders slick with blood. Mothers clutched infants to their breasts, shielding them from falling beams. Bells rang, not for prayer but in warning, then broke and fell in molten clamor. In the chaos, this sword clashed in desperate arcs, its edge catching sparks from torches and its bearer's breath tearing into the night like a prayer unanswered. When the keep collapsed, when timbers fell and stones cracked, the knight's hand slipped and the sword tumbled into ash. It lay there as the fire consumed all else, tables, vestments, parchments inked with law and lineage, until only stone and steel remained. Stone to crumble, steel to sleep. And so the sword endured, half buried in soot, shielded by ruin. The man who wielded it has no grave. His bones lie scattered with those of peasants and priests alike, indistinguishable beneath centuries of decay. But his sword remains, a relic of his last defense, a silent witness to fire's hunger. The symbolism is inescapable. Ash as both destruction and remembrance, fire as both purifier and annihilator. The narrator breathes softly. Ash is memory made dust. It clings long after flames die, carrying the taste of grief on every breeze. This sword carries ash as if it were skin, as if the knight himself still clings to it, begging for his story to be told. The hilt is lifted gently, and with it comes a fall of gray dust, as though the ruin itself exhales. The blade is pitted, fractured by heat, but unmistakably a crusader's weapon. Its weight is uneven now, its strength diminished, but still it hums faintly, a resonance that vibrates against the hand like the fading echo of a chant. It is no ordinary relic. To hold it is to hear the voices of those who perished in the flames. The priest coughing out his last psalm as smoke rose into the rafters, the child gasping in silence as her mother shielded her, the knight gritting his teeth against the weight of collapsing stone. They linger not as ghosts, but as impressions pressed into the steel itself. The sword is their memorial, their gravestone, their unmarked epitaph. And yet there is something more. For in the ruin of this keep lies a secret wound of history, a reminder that chivalry's age was not gilded glory, but brutal survival. Knights were not saints in shining mail, but men driven by hunger, loyalty, rage, and fear. Keeps were not eternal sanctuaries, but fragile bastions forever threatened by fire, famine, and betrayal. And swords such as this were both protectors and betrayers, tools of devotion that too easily became agents of despair. The narrator pauses, voice lowering into near silence, as though speaking across centuries. The flames consume their fortress, but not their silence. That silence clings still, woven into the ash, waiting for us to breathe it back into sound. The camera of the mind lingers now upon the ruins' details. The broken crucifix charred into black wood, the melted rivets glinting faintly among rubble, the stone steps leading to nowhere. The sword rests among them like the last voice of the fallen, a survivor not of flesh but of iron. Its presence demands remembrance, its scars insist upon retelling. And as it is raised into the open air, the ash falls like snow, descending slowly, weightless, as if blessing the sword's return. The wind carries it upward, scattering it into the pale sky. It is as though the fortress breathes one last sigh, its memory finally allowed to drift free. The narrator softens, guiding us to the threshold of the next chapter. The ash tells of ruin, but not of what came after. For from ruin rises silence, and from silence emerges devotion. Prayers whispered in cloisters, vows uttered behind veils. The sword leads us there, from fire to faith, from ruin to remembrance. The ruins fade into shadow, leaving only the image of the blade, scorched but unbroken, its edge dulled, yet its presence undeniable. The camera lingers on the glint of its pommel, a tiny spark against the gray. Then darkness descends, the silence thick, carrying us forward into the hidden corridors of faith where steel and prayer entwined. The chapter closes like a door upon fire's roar, opening instead into the hush of cloisters, into the flicker of candles, into the next movement of the story. The fallen are ashes now, but the sword, scarred and enduring, summons us onward. A raven's cry cuts the silence, harsh and lingering, as black wings stir the cold morning air. Its shadow glides across a courtyard of wet flagstones, each stone slick with moss and centuries of rain. The scent here is sharp and earthy, the smell of stone soaked in drizzle, of lichen clinging stubbornly to cracks, of old iron rusting quietly beneath forgotten archways. The bird circles once, twice before alighting on a toppled column. And as its wings fold, a single feather detaches, caught in a wandering breeze. The feather drifts downward slowly, gracefully, twisting through shafts of pale light. It falls in silence, floating until it settles upon something half buried in the courtyard's corner. The dull curve of a blade, resting among stones. The feather lands lightly upon the steel, and for a heartbeat, the softness of down and the hardness of iron seem fused together. Fragility and strength, tenderness and violence, bound by chance and time. The narrator's voice enters like an echo carried on the breeze. Once, this steel was raised in fury. Once it sang the hymn of war, but now it lies in silence, a cradle for the delicate fall of a feather. The sword is drawn slowly from its resting place. Rust flakes scatter onto the stone, tiny red embers of time's relentless hunger. The hilt is worn smooth, as if countless palms pressed against it in nights of unease, fingers tightening around a promise of survival. The leather binding has all but dissolved, leaving faint ridges where a craftsman's hand once pulled it taut. Yet even in ruin, the sword carries weight, not only of metal, but of memory. The feather clings for a moment longer, caught in a groove along the fuller of the blade, before a gust lifts it away, sending it spiraling upward into the courtyard's empty air. The narrator whispers, "A feather upon steel, fragility upon strength. This is how memory rests, soft upon the unyielding, fleeting upon the eternal." From this image, the story deepens. This was the blade of a knight, not only of war, but of pilgrimage. He had walked far beyond these wet stones, across seas where salt stung the lips and sails cracked like whips in the wind. He had carried this weapon into lands where the sun burned without mercy, where the air smelled of spices unfamiliar, and where tongues he did not understand sang prayers not unlike his own. This sword cut through the dust of deserts and returned to the mists of the north, scarred, pitted, but unbroken. Imagine the man who bore it. A crusader, perhaps, but also a pilgrim. He prayed beneath Gothic arches, where incense clouded the air and Latin psalms rose like smoke into vaulted heavens. Yet he also prayed in silence, alone, staring into the sands under a crescent moon, his faith fraying like the bindings of his sword's hilt. The world had grown vast for him, vast and strange, and every step carried both revelation and weight. We hear faint echoes, the mutter of Arabic traders bargaining in markets fragrant with cinnamon and frankincense, the rasp of Latin prayers whispered in cloisters, the cry of gulls above port cities where sails bloomed like fields of cloth. These sounds are stitched into the steel, lingering even now. The blade is both map and memory, bearing scars from places far from this mossy courtyard. But there is another memory hidden within it, softer and more fragile, like the feather that graced its surface. A girl, perhaps, in the keep he once called home. She watched him leave with the solemn gaze of one who understood absence before it arrived. He promised return, as all knights did, words offered like coins for comfort. And she, silent, pressed something into his hand, a ribbon, a prayer bead, or perhaps only her gaze. He carried that weight alongside his sword, though only one returned. The narrator's tone lingers here, weaving fragility into the iron. Every weapon carries not only the blood it shed, but the tears of those who watched it depart. This steel holds both. The feather drifts back into our vision, caught once more upon the wind, rising higher this time, carried beyond the ruined courtyard into the sky. Its ascent mirrors the soul of the girl left behind, unseen in chronicles, her story hidden in the spaces between parchment lines. History does not write her name, yet the sword, lying silent, remembers. For steel remembers touch as much as battle, absence as much as violence. The symbolism grows stronger. The feather is innocence, lost too soon. The steel is duty, heavy and consuming. Together they embody the eternal tension of the medieval soul, torn between vows of faith and the quiet desires of human longing. The knight who bore this sword was caught in that tension, bound by both oath and love, exiled from both in the end. We linger on textures, the coarse wool of his cloak dampened by rain, the bitter taste of ale gulped in dim halls before departure, the acrid smoke of torches hissing in sea winds. The sword was his anchor, his shield, his confessor. When men fell around him, when sand filled his eyes, he tightened his grip not only on steel, but on the memory of home, of her. That memory traveled across continents, across seas, and returned with him, only to be buried in silence. And so the blade lies now in this courtyard, kissed by moss and rain, visited by birds and silence. It is no longer raised in fury. It is cradle for a feather, altar for memory. And as it is lifted once more, the narrator's voice breathes softly. The feather rises, the steel endures. Fragility departs, strength remains. But what endures without what it has lost? The question lingers, echoing through the silence as the image fades. We see the feather spiraling upward, swallowed by pale light, while the sword glimmers faintly below. The story does not end here. For the sword is not only steel, not only memory of battle or of love. It is a threshold, a doorway. And beyond it lies the deeper silence of cloisters, where faith whispered itself into existence beneath veils of stone and candle smoke. The chapter closes with the hush of wind through ruined arches, the flutter of unseen wings, the faint echo of prayer bells carried on distant air. The feather is gone. The steel remains. And through their parting, we are summoned forward to trace the paths where devotion eclipsed desire, where steel and prayer entwined, where silence became heavier than sound. The narrator falls silent, leaving only the image of the sword upon the courtyard stones, fragile and unyielding at once. It waits, poised at the threshold, leading us into the veiled chambers of faith and exile, into the next unfolding of memory. The wind dies as we step into shadow. The ruin of a chapel rises before us, half collapsed yet still breathing the silence of centuries. Its transept arches, fractured but unyielding, bend like ribs of a giant laid to rest. Dust drifts where sunlight cuts through broken stained glass, painting shards of color across the stone floor, reds and blues, as if spilled wine and tears had seeped into the cracks. The air is heavy with the smell of damp mortar and the faint, lingering sweetness of beeswax that once burned in 1,000 candles. A hand brushes across a pew, its wood worm-eaten, its hymnal pages mildewed and brittle. Beneath that dust lies something wrapped in linen, fraying and yellowed with age. The cloth is stiff with time, stiff with the oils of countless fingers that once held it in reverence. As it unravels, the glimmer of iron emerges, dull, shadowed, yet unmistakably holy. A sword concealed not upon the battlefield, but here, among prayers and hymns. The narrator's voice is hushed, as though intruding upon a midnight vigil. This was no common blade. This was steel baptized not in rivers, but in prayer. The sword lies across the altar like a relic of martyrdom, its surface touched by the wax drippings of long-dead candles. Along the hilt, faint traces of embroidery cling to the linen wrap, symbols of faith sewn by hands now dust. Mercy, courage, penance, words threaded in silence, carried as silent prayers into battle. The pommel glimmers faintly where lips once pressed against it, a kiss of devotion before the march into darkness. We hear echoes now, faint but insistent, the low murmur of monks chanting in Latin, voices blending into one unbroken river of sound, the shuffle of woolen robes, the clink of censers spilling incense that curls upward in gray veils. These sounds linger in the stone, imprinted like shadows. The chapel is not empty. It breathes with the ghosts of devotion. The narrator guides us deeper. This was a sword carried not only into wars of blood, but into wars of conscience. For knights were bound not merely by lords, but by faith. They swore oaths in cloisters, their armor gleaming beneath frescoes of saints, their voices trembling as vows were spoken beneath stained glass saints who never knew the weight of steel. Each oath tied them not to glory, but to silence, chains invisible, binding them to sacrifice, to guilt, to obedience that often cut deeper than any enemy's blade. This sword belonged to one such knight, a man of both faith and fracture. He knelt where the air smelled of incense and damp stone, and pledged himself to causes larger than his soul could carry. Yet every vow carved another mark upon him. Duty became exile, devotion became burden, faith became a veil that hid more than it revealed. Perhaps that is why the sword rests here, hidden beneath linen like a body laid in shroud. It was not abandoned, it was interred. We linger on sensory details, the cool touch of the altar stone, the flicker of candlelight staining the blade with gold, the scent of parchment inked with prayers and hymns now fading to dust. The sword rests as if asleep, enfolded in the rhythms of monastic life. Bells tolled above these walls, calling to prayer, to labor, to silence. The sword lay still, bearing witness, as chants rolled like waves against the vaulted ceiling. The narrator's tone softens, reflective. This steel knew violence, yet here wrapped in prayer, it was asked to become something else. Not a weapon, but a relic. Not an instrument of death, but a symbol of devotion. And yet, devotion is never simple. The same sword that was blessed in cloisters cut through flesh in deserts, pierced armor in muddy fields, silenced the voices of men who prayed in other tongues. It was lifted in the name of God, but its shadow carried doubt. Perhaps the knight who carried it knew this. Perhaps that is why he returned it to this place, laying it down upon an altar in silence, leaving it to rest not as blade but as confession. The symbolism deepens, the veil that once covered this sword, like the veil that covers the altar, like the veil that conceals truth behind ritual. Faith both revealed and concealed. Steel both sanctified and stained. The narrator's voice almost breaks into whisper. The veil is never only cloth. It is silence. It is shame. It is devotion hidden within shadows. As the blade is lifted from the altar, fragments of wax fall away like tears hardened by centuries. Light strikes it through the shattered, stained glass, illuminating its rusted edge in a prism of red and blue. The chapel sighs. The wind presses against the broken walls, stirring the dust into swirls, as though the silence itself resists the unveiling. But unveiled it must be. For in this sword lies the story of a man divided between violence and prayer, between loyalty to flesh and loyalty to faith. To hold it is to hold contradiction, to feel both the strength of oath and the weakness of guilt. Its iron hums faintly, a sound like a psalm sung through gritted teeth. The narrator breathes slowly. Steel remembers the hymns it heard, and in remembering it asks us, what is devotion worth if it demands blood? What is faith if it must be hidden beneath veils? The question lingers as the chapel darkens. Candles are gone. Monks are gone. The sword alone remains, carried now into light once more. The sound of a single bell echoes in the distance, tolling slowly, a heartbeat stretched across time. The final image closes the chapter, the sword cradled in linen once again, lifted gently as shards of stained glass glow in the dawn. Behind it, the ruined chapel collapses back into shadow, its silence intact. Ahead lies the next threshold, not the cloisters of prayer, but the forests of exile, where roots and earth will bind memory deeper still. The narrator's voice fades with a breath. The veil has lifted, and in the lifting we step from prayer into wilderness, from cloister into exile, from faith into the hunger of the earth itself. Darkness returns. The bell tolls once more, and then silence. The forest floor is soft with decay. Leaves rot in layers, their edges curling like old parchment, their veins darkened by time. The air tastes of damp earth and bark, heavy with the musk of fungi rising unseen. Above, the oak stands, ancient and gnarled, its branches bending as though carrying the weight of centuries. Its roots coil outward like veins exposed, gripping the soil with the strength of a giant who will not be moved. Nestled among those roots lies iron. Rusted, soil-stained, half swallowed by moss. A sword abandoned where earth and tree conspired to keep it hidden. Its hilt protrudes like bone through skin, rough with verdigris, wrapped now by tendrils of ivy. The oak has drunk deeply from the soil around it, and in doing so has entwined itself with steel. The tree and the sword have become one. The narrator's voice lowers, resonant as the groan of branches in the wind. Here lies exile. Here lies the burden of silence. Roots hold what hands could no longer carry. This was the weapon of a knight driven into wilderness, perhaps cast out from the keep, stripped of banner and name. Perhaps he left of his own accord, heavy with guilt that no prayer could lighten. Whatever the cause, his exile ended here, beneath the oak. The same hands that once lifted this blade in fury pressed it into soil in surrender. To bury a sword is to bury more than steel. It is to bury a life's oath, to hide shame beneath the weight of earth, to trust silence to hold what memory could not bear. We linger on the textures, the ridges of bark pressing against a mailed shoulder as the night leaned in weariness, the bitter taste of acorns chewed in hunger when bread was gone, the smell of damp wool steaming as rain dried slowly against a dwindling fire. Exile was not grand, not noble. It was hunger. It was cold. It was the sound of wind through branches when no other voices remained. Yet even in exile, the sword endured. Rust spread across its edge, but its presence remained sharp as memory. For every man who abandons steel carries its ghost still in his chest. The knight may have turned from war, from lords, from vows, but the blade was always there. Silent, heavy, calling. The oak only masked it, never erased it. The symbolism grows heavy. Oak for endurance, roots for bonds unseen, iron for duty that does not fade. As the narrator intones, time turns iron to dust, but oaths do not dissolve. They root themselves into the soil of memory, entwined with the very ground that buries them. We see the knight in his final years, hair tangled with leaves, hands blistered from cutting firewood instead of wielding steel. He drinks from streams muddied with deer tracks. He prays no longer in Latin, but in silence, his words carried only to the wind. Birds scold him from branches, squirrels chatter with indifference. Yet still the sword waits beneath the roots, a reminder that his exile is chosen but not complete. For even as he turns from war, the war within him rages on. The narrator draws us deeper into the tension. Was this surrender or was it defiance? To lay down a sword could be penance, but it could also be rebellion. Perhaps he buried it not to forget, but to defy the order that demanded he carry it. Perhaps the roots that coil around its hilt are not shackles, but guardians, keeping it from being raised again in service of oaths he no longer believed in. The forest becomes a cathedral. The rustle of leaves is its chant, the creak of boughs its organ. Candle smoke is replaced by pine resin and damp moss. The knight's prayers dissolve into silence, and yet the sword remains his altar. Even in decay, it binds him to the life he fled. We hear faint echoes, the ringing of a blacksmith's hammer from years past, the laughter in a hall where roasted meat sizzled and horns of ale clinked, the roar of battle on fields where banners whipped in wind. These echoes bleed into the forest's silence, reminders that exile is not escape, but memory unending. The narrator softens, almost pitying. Roots entwine, but they do not heal. They hold, they bind, they remind. At last, the sword is uncovered again. Soil falls away from it in clumps, clinging stubbornly, as if the earth itself refuses to release it. The hilt is lifted, and the roots snap reluctantly, like sinews torn. The blade rises into the pale forest light, rust flaring red against the green canopy. It trembles as though resisting, as though memory does not wish to be disturbed. The oak groans in the wind, its branches shivering. Leaves cascade downward, blanketing the ground in rust-colored silence. The forest seems to mourn the unearthing, as though the act is sacrilege. But the sword is no longer content to sleep, it has been found. The narrator breathes, each word heavy. Iron may rust, but memory does not, and memory demands voice. The closing image is stark. The sword, lifted high against the sky, dripping earth from its blade. Roots dangle from its hilt like chains torn free. Around it, the oak looms silent, a sentinel robbed of its secret. The forest waits in hush, the wind pressing through branches like a psalm unspoken. The voiceover lowers into whisper. Exile ends, but not in peace. What was buried returns. What was silenced demands to be heard. Darkness gathers at the edges of the forest. The sound of distant bells carries faintly, calling us away from wilderness, back toward the lives of men, where song and steel once mingled in uneasy harmony. The sword has risen from soil. Now it will sing again, this time not in wilderness, but in song, where silence and steel entwine in a new and haunting chorus. The chapter closes with silence, punctuated by the soft fall of a single acorn striking the ground. Roots and iron have parted. The story demands to move forward. The forest breathes with an unearthly stillness, as if holding its voice in reverence. Pine needles hush the ground, soft as velvet beneath weary boots. Resin perfumes the air, sharp and sweet, mingling with the dampness of moss that clings to fallen logs. The canopy sways like a vaulted ceiling of green, and every gust of wind becomes a whisper, a psalm carried across branches. Against the trunk of a tree, half hidden in the carpet of needles, rests the sword. Its blade leans at an angle, balanced awkwardly as though forgotten mid-gesture. Needles cling to its edge, softening the iron, turning weapon into relic. No battlefield surrounds it now. No chapel cradles it. Only wilderness where silence reigns. And yet silence is not emptiness. For the forest has a voice, and those who wander long enough hear it. The steady rhythm of branches creaking, the shrill call of distant jays, the hollow thump of a woodpecker tapping for unseen sustenance. The narrator's voice enters low, tender, reverent. This is not the silence of death. This is the silence of waiting. And in waiting, even steel learns to sing. The knight who bore this blade was unlike the others. He carried not only armor, but song. A minstrel knight, part warrior, part poet, whose lute hung from his shoulder alongside his scabbard. He fought, yes, but he also sang. In torchlit halls, in village squares, in lonely encampments where hunger gnawed and men huddled close to fire. His voice carried tales of devotion and despair, of saints who suffered and lovers who wept. And when he lifted his sword, it sang too, in arcs of steel that echoed the same longing, the same ache. Imagine him here, in the hush of pine and fog. His cloak is damp, his lute warped by weather, yet he strums still, fingers stiff but faithful. The melody drifts between the trunks, notes scattering like sparks, until the forest itself seems to hum in answer. And beside him lies his sword, silent but attuned, the two instruments of his divided life, music and war, prayer and violence. We hear fragments, the pluck of strings echoing against stone in a distant hall, the clash of swords in training yards where squires shouted and sparrows scattered, the laughter of peasants clapping to songs that masked hunger with joy. These echoes converge, blending into the forest's breath. The minstrel's life was a chorus of contrasts, where silence was filled not by bells or chants, but by melody spun from pain. The narrator breathes slowly. To sing with steel is to confess what words cannot bear. His music was his absolution, his blade his penance. Together they became the hymn of his exile. We linger on textures, the worn wood of the lute's neck, grooved by countless songs. The leather strap frayed where it brushed against chainmail, the cool touch of steel when fingers left strings for hilt. The minstrel knight lived between worlds, mocked by some as soft, envied by others for his voice, feared by those who knew how his song turned to steel when provoked. His companions remembered not only his battles, but the way he sang men to sleep on nights when hunger bit hardest, his lullabies carrying them into dreams less bitter than reality. And yet, his songs carried sorrow. Beneath every refrain was the ache of loss, of the girl whose eyes lingered in his memory, of the keep that burned behind him, of the cloisters whose prayers never eased his burden. His music was no celebration. It was mourning. It was confession. It was silence transfigured into sound. The forest becomes his stage now. The pine needles muffle footsteps as though hushing an audience. The air shivers with each plucked note, each whispered lyric half lost to time. And when he sets aside the lute and grips his sword, the silence deepens, waiting for the strike. Steel cuts air as bow cuts string, and the forest listens. In his hands, the sword is not only weapon but instrument, its rhythm the beat of battle, its resonance the echo of grief. The narrator's tone sharpens, mournful. Here, steel sang. It sang not of glory, but of sorrow, not of victory, but of wounds. Each strike was a verse, each wound a chorus. His life was not war, not music, but the silence between them. We feel his loneliness. No audience remains, no comrades gather near. The only witness now is the forest, its shadows stretching like pews, its canopy swaying like a roof of stone. His songs dissolve into the air, notes fading into the silence they defied. His sword, once raised in prayer and fury, now rests against a fallen trunk, needles blanketing it as though the forest itself seeks to hush its memory. But memory does not sleep. As the blade is lifted once more, the needles fall in a hushed cascade, scattering across the ground like notes vanishing into silence. The edge glimmers faintly in the dim light, and the air thickens with presence, as if the forest, the night, the music, and the blade are one. The narrator's voice softens to a whisper. The song has ended, but silence is not the end. Silence is only the threshold. The camera of the mind lingers on the closing image, the sword resting once more against the tree, its edge dulled but dignified, its presence both burden and hymn. The forest sways gently, the wind carrying the ghost of a melody long vanished. Silence presses in again, heavy yet alive. And from that silence, another sound emerges faintly. Distant bells tolling from a village unseen, their echo reaching even here into the cathedral of trees. A summons. A reminder that exile does not last forever, that even song must return to dust, that steel must find its final resting place. The chapter closes with the faint vibration of those bells, as though steel itself is humming an answer. The minstrel's voice is gone, but his song lingers in the iron, awaiting the final act. The narrator exhales, the words fading into shadow. The forest remembers, the steel remembers, but memory alone cannot carry eternity. The song must end. The silence must deepen, and only then can the last chapter begin. Darkness descends. The bells toll once more, fading into distance, carrying us toward the sword's final revelation, where silence and memory converge in the last great stand of history. The bells toll once more, low and distant, their echoes folding across valleys, across fields heavy with frost. The sound carries like a summons, pulling us from forest silence toward an unseen horizon. Beyond the trees, beyond the ruined chapels and forgotten keeps, lies the last stage of the sword's long pilgrimage, the field of its final stand. The air sharpens here. The wind tastes of iron and smoke, though no fires burn. The ground is uneven, scarred with depressions where old walls once stood, where trenches filled with mud and blood once carved the land. Grass now covers the wounds, but the soil beneath is dark and heavy, as though still nourished by those who fell. And upon this soil, the sword rests once more, its edge broken, its hilt battered, but its presence undeniable. The narrator's voice enters, solemn, steady, each word carved like stone. This is where silence becomes memory. This is where steel becomes story. This is where the forgotten stand once more. The Crusader who bore this sword did not die in exile, nor in cloister, nor in forest song. He died here, amid chaos, in a last defense that history has half forgotten. Picture it. Banners torn and trampled, shields splintered, the roar of war like thunder against the sky. The clash of steel was deafening, and yet beneath it, silence grew. The silence of men who knew they would not leave this field. The silence of prayer whispered between strikes, of last breaths caught on the wind. The knight stood among them, his sword heavy, his lungs aflame with smoke. Around him, comrades fell, their cries cut short, their eyes fixed skyward as if seeking mercy they could not name. The ground turned to mire beneath boots, slick with blood, clotted with straw and dirt. Horses screamed as they collapsed, armor buckled beneath weight. And still the knight stood, his sword rising and falling in rhythm with his breath, each stroke an act of defiance, each step a refusal to yield. This was no victory. This was survival measured only in moments, each heartbeat stolen from inevitability. The knight knew it, his companions knew it. And still they fought, not for triumph, but for honor, for each other, for the unseen faces waiting beyond the walls. Their stand was doomed, but in that doom lay a strange and terrible beauty. The narrator lowers his tone, almost whispering. Greatness is not in victory, but in refusal. The last stand is not glory, it is silence made flesh. We linger on details, the crack of arrows piercing shields, the acrid smoke of pitch pots hurled across walls, the wet slap of mud against greaves as men staggered into place. The knight's hand bled, split open from gripping the hilt too tightly. His voice was hoarse from shouting prayers that dissolved into screams, and still he did not let go. The sword became an extension of his body, his faith, his failure, his final devotion. And then the breaking, the line collapsing. The moment when the tide surged too strongly, when the last defenders fell. The knight raised his sword once more, though his arms trembled, though his sight dimmed. His final act was not conquest, but resistance. His final cry was not command, but confession. And when the blade slipped from his grasp, the earth claimed it, not as spoil of war, but as witness. The soil remembers, the ash remembers. The feather, the veil, the roots, the song, they all lead here. Every fragment of his journey converges in this last stand, where silence and defiance became one. The sword lying in earth is not only relic, it is testament. Testament that men fought, fell, and vanished, but left behind the weight of their devotion, their exile, their sorrow. The narrator's voice deepens, reverent. We call them forgotten, but forgotten they are not, for steel remembers, soil remembers, silence remembers. And when silence is broken, their story rises again. The field lies quiet now. Birds wheel overhead. The grass sways gently, hiding scars. But in the ground beneath, the sword hums faintly still, as though the clash of battle has never fully ended. Its rusted edge is the echo of that defiance. Its battered hilt the memory of hands that would not yield. And so the chapter closes in imagery both stark and tender. The sword rests upon the soil, its surface glinting faintly in the last light of day. The sky above shifts to crimson, then to deep violet, as though the heavens themselves bleed for what was lost. The wind hushes, carrying with it the faintest echo of bells, tolling for the dead, tolling for remembrance. The narrator exhales, each word a benediction. The last stand is never final. For as long as steel endures, as long as silence breathes, memory remains. And in remembering, we keep their voices alive. The sword has spoken, the soil has yielded, the silence has ended. Darkness gathers, the screen fades to black, only the hum of silence remains, heavy, eternal, sacred. And thus, the journey closes, not with victory, but with remembrance. The sword, once unearthed, has led us across soil, ash, feather, veil, roots, and song, into the heart of silence itself. Its story is not only of war, but of exile, devotion, and the human need to endure even when hope is gone. The final image lingers unseen but felt, the sword sinking once more into earth, where it will rest until another hand unearths it. Another voice tells its story. Another age learns to listen.